And I'll tell you, the most important date for me in the history of climate change was August 25th, 2014. That was the date my son was born. That's my wife, Laurie, and that's the first moment she saw Henry. Henry is now 3, and that's the first time I got to hold him. How many parents do we have in the room? So I'm going to talk to y'all specifically for a second because we share a moment here, and I think there's 2 moments kind of wrapped up in one. The first moment is the overwhelming joy, and then the second moment is the overwhelming terror that you're going to break it. And then the third moment that's kind of comes immediately after that is kind of the threat assessment. Like, what's coming for your kid that you got to protect your kid from? And here's one of the main threats for my kid. This was 2 weeks after he was born. This headline in The Guardian: greenhouse gas emissions rise at fastest rate for 30 years. This is the policy response. The United States went to Bonn and promoted universal access to fossil fuels at a climate change action conference internationally. It's exactly the wrong, most toxic action you could take, both from a diplomatic perspective, since we're now the only country not participating in the Paris Agreement. Even Syria is participating in the Paris Agreement, and their country is in ruins from the Civil War. So this is where we are physically, temperature-wise. The year so far, compared to other January through October so far, you can see the basic trend. We are now in a period where we will never again see a colder than average year. I am willing to place a bet on that. We are done with colder than average years forever. And in this context, you can see at the end where Henry's born, the 3 big spikes at the end. That's his life so far. You know, I got into a little tussle with some of the local press early on in the campaign because I made this statement that Henry had been alive for the 3 hottest years on record. And there was some hemming and hawing among folks in the journalistic community that said, oh, but that's globally. What about here in Texas? I mean, it's everywhere. To think that because we're in the United States, we're going to be protected from this is just wrong. And we saw that with the weather events that happened immediately after with the hurricanes. January through October this year, for this year so far, the planet's been incredibly hot. The redder it is, the more anomalously warm it is. I'll draw your attention to the spot just below Greenland. There's a cold spot. And the reason that is significant is that the catastrophic scenario, the kind of day after tomorrow scenario, is that cold, fresh water off of Greenland melts and forms kind of a freshwater lens that just sits on top of the water. And it pushes the warm salt water under the ice shelves. And what that does is accelerate the breakdown of the ice, which will then be like a cork being taken out of a bottle. The land ice can start to slide off very quickly. And the phenomenon that goes along with that is the shutdown of the circulation in the Atlantic Ocean, which smooths out temperature gradients. So what you're essentially creating when that phenomenon gets real steam behind it is a permanent storm front in the Atlantic Ocean where there's really hot water next to really cold water, and you're set up for superstorms. And this is just all of last year, and you can see how pronounced the cold spot was last year during the El Nino year, which was hotter than normal, and you can see how much cold water is sitting there off Greenland. Ted Cruz and Lamar Smith and folks in their cadre have tried to say is that NOAA and NASA have been cooking the books and creating a climate change phenomenon by being selective in their measurements. These are the 4 top climate science organizations in the world. It's NASA Goddard Institute, Hadley Center for Climate Research, NOAA, and the Japanese Meteorological Agency, all showing essentially the same phenomenon, that it's getting hotter, and there's just no denying it. And just to emphasize this is NASA saying so. And on their website, you can find, when the site is up, consensus statements from 18 scientific societies, all of the major interest groups that represent chemical companies or any company that's interested in science as a field, saying that human activity is behind climate change as a phenomenon. That little flash there was the 404 page, because in a very suspicious manner, that NASA climate page is down quite a bit these days. What I'm going to show you some quotes from now, the Climate Science Special Report from the National Climate Assessment. Federal agencies, in kind of a show of defiance against this denialism coming from the administration, said, you know what, not quite true. And they've made some very strong statements about the current state of the climate, which include this period is now the warmest in the history of modern civilization. It is extremely likely that human activities, especially emissions of greenhouse gases, are the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century. And, for the kicker, there is no convincing alternative explanation supported by the extent of observational evidence. What they are telling us is, this is fact. There is no convincing, coherent explanation other than your carbon emissions are driving global warming. We are headed for a 4 to 6 degrees Celsius world. National promises under 3 to 4 degrees, under Paris, only get us to 3 to 4 degrees temperature increases. We need to get down under 1.5. That's before Trump. We are headed towards a scenario that society cannot adapt to. When we say that, we're going to deal with climate change through mitigation and preparation and not through prevention, we are setting ourselves up for a planet in which we can't survive as a society. The milder scenario, which has been sketched out in a recent study just for our area, shows that if we just have the middle of the road projections for the middle of the road sea level rise and we hit the 2-degree target, Austin Round Rock will have to absorb more than 800,000 people who are fleeing from the coasts, who will have to move because their communities are no longer viable. But the little footnote to that study is that the only people who can stay and survive are the people that make over $100,000 a year. But the worry in this report is that the poorer people won't be able to evacuate. Now, I want you to think about what that means. We saw Hurricane Katrina already. We saw people packed into a Superdome. That's what it looks like when poor people can't evacuate from a climate disaster. And they're talking about that on every coast. Science is the closest thing we can have for seeing the future. And the future that I see for my son goes one of two ways. We either stay on the current course, and by the time he gets into kindergarten, we blow the carbon budget, possibly. The kicker to this presentation is that when you take these assumptions out that are in the IPCC projections that we talked about, which essentially are either magic or time travel, we have between 3 and 13 years before we blow the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the political action that's implied in that, and excuse me for being a tiny bit political, is people who believe in climate science have to take Congress this cycle. Because there's almost no hope, even in that situation, that we will hit that target, even if we get in that scenario. But there is no hope for saving island nations if we don't take Congress this year. The problem is, we don't know what the tipping points are. We know in broad strokes what the scenario is, but we will never the bell will not go off when we cross the threshold where the soil stops storing carbon. You're not going to get an alert on your phone when the ice system collapses so far that it's not reflective enough to stop the total collapse of the ice caps. You're not going to get, nobody's going to tweet at you to tell you that methane is coming out of the permafrost. You're just going to wander into it one day and lose the ability as a society to affect which direction the trends are going. Because there will come a point here, if we don't take action, that the carbon that's stored in the ground will be released in such massive quantities that nothing we can do can affect it. And we only have somewhere between 3 and 13 years before one of the big red lines comes our way. But what that means is emissions have to be brought to net zero yesterday. There is no time for incremental solutions right now. And that means, that we have to come, if you take all of these considerations that we said we believed in the Paris Agreement seriously, and we're not going to make the poor countries bear the majority of the burden, that means we have to give them a little more time than the rest of us to get their emissions to zero. But that means they have to be at zero in the non-OECD countries by 2050. But for us to give them the time to do that, we have to get it done by 2035. But that is a 12% year-on-year reduction starting January 1st of this year. there's no scenario if we don't take control of Congress or local governments to the extent enough with people who believe in climate science where we can hit those targets. But if you think about it, 10% of the global emitters are responsible for 50% of the emissions. And the top 1% in the US have a carbon footprint 2,500 times that of the bottom 1%. Meaning they use so much carbon that they're basically a small town walking around. So climate justice is really the only way of approaching this issue. It means fast near-term reductions in the top 10% emissions. It means that most of the global population isn't rich enough and can't even spend enough carbon to affect the solution here. It's all on rich countries like us. It's the rich and the very rich. Some of the things that are missing from this are things like carbon fee and dividend proposals, things like carbon equivalency fees, which means you're taxing goods at the border that come in from countries that don't have a carbon fee on their goods. It means increasing the weatherization budgets, because that's a really quick way to increase both the energy efficiency and to make some good paying jobs right off the top. An infrastructure bill that has mass transit and charging stations for electric vehicles, ban on fossil fuel explorations, and actually funding the Department of Energy's energy efficiency and renewable energy R&D budgets. So I'm going to leave you here with a little bit of a more emotional note than the dry numbers we've been talking about. This is the night before I filed to run for office. My son and I took a break and just had a little nap. My wife got a good photo of this. But this is the kind of thing we're protecting here. When it gets right down to it, we're not interested in climate change action and political organizing around this issue because we care about charts or graphs or the composition of the atmosphere in just an agnostic sense. We're caring about protecting the things that we love and making sure that the people we love and that we're responsible for have a future that we would feel proud to give them. And in the current political environment, we are not headed in that direction. And we talked a lot about fake news, but again, the reason that this is a tactic now on the part of the folks who want to keep, clean coal coming is that truth has claims on our behavior. And I want you to leave here tonight with the strong sense that there's no time left and that there's nobody else to do it but the people in this room. We have to own the moment here, because there's no one else that's going to be capable of owning the moment ever again if the runaway effects take hold. And the timer is extraordinarily short. In fact, Henry here needs us to take action in 3 to 13 years. By the time he graduates high school, we're going to put the period on the end of the sentence that describes how we reacted to this moment. And on his behalf, as a dad, I'm asking you to take your participation in this group as seriously as if you were here to save the world, because you are here to save the world. And the good news is, if you look at those charts and you project them out over a 10,000 year time frame, once we get past 2100 and 2200, those lines go flat and they stay where they are essentially forever. So the risk is what we lose forever, but the hope is that what you save, you will save forever. The world gets to be your monument for every generation that comes after. Politicians need to hear from you. Your elected officials who are already in office need to hear from you, and your neighbors need to hear from you. Because the worst thing that happens when a fire alarm goes off is everybody looks around to see if anybody else is getting up. All of us have probably been in a scenario where somebody pulled a fire alarm and nobody moved. Well, somebody's got to move. And you're moving now, and I appreciate you doing that, and I thank you for your attention tonight, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.